second, I'll stand close to the middle.
Okay, good morning. I'm Joshua Shinkle. I'm a PhD student from Purdue University, and today I have the pleasure of presenting our work called No Privacy for Privates: How Military Communities Experience and Perceive the Privacy Risks Posed by Military-Marketed Mobile Apps. So this is a joint work with colleagues at Purdue and Florida International University and the Army Cyber Institute and the United States Military Academy, and we're very honored to be the recipients of this award, and also honored yesterday, the Wired online news presence released an article about our paper. So without further ado, there we go. Okay, so let me start in 2018 when Strava released a global heat map of all of its users' fitness activity, which includes the fitness activity of US service members on forward operating bases, which makes those bases both identifiable and mappable, which reveals secret military installations as well as patrol routes. So this asymmetry is exactly what motivates our project. You see, for a civilian, if their location data is leaked, that is a privacy concern. But for a military service member, if their location data is leaked, it puts their entire unit, the physical safety of their entire unit, at risk. So, what is important to note here is that it's the same app data practices, but they carry radically different stakes because of the at-risk population. And Strava is not an isolated incident. The entire app economy is set up around the collecting and selling of user data. In fact, there's an entire data broker industry that is specifically selling data that is targeted towards active service members. So, for example, target your eyes here towards this red box and read some of those data types. As you can see, when those data types are aggregated, it could enable things like surveillance, social engineering, and even targeted attacks. But within this ecosystem, there's a subset of apps that even go a step further. They are apps that explicitly market themselves towards military service members. So we call these military marketed mobile apps, and an example would be USAA, which advertises itself as an organization founded by military members for military members. Now, this branding earns these apps a real degree of trust, and to drive the point home, part of the significance of this is that most of these apps, the vast majority of these apps from our research, are commercial apps. They're third-party apps. They're not built by the government or by the military. So to recap our motivation, we have trusted apps that are soliciting the data of an at-risk population, and yet what these apps do with that data and how their users think about it had not yet been studied. And so that's the gap that we set out to close. And we break that into two research questions. The first one has to do with in-practice risks. So we specifically ask, what data practices and code provenance characteristics are present in military marketed apps? And code provenance here means the geographic origin of all the code in the app. So whether written by the developer or third parties that they include. And our second research question has to do with the perception of risk. So we break this into three sub-questions, which are, how well do those data practices and code provenance characteristics align with what military-affiliated personnel consider appropriate? What data inferences and threat scenarios do they believe are possible, and which security domains are at risk? Which mitigations do they believe are most effective, and which would they be most likely to adopt or support? So now, briefly on methodology, we took a two-pronged approach. The first was a technical analysis of 242 military marketed apps. So this was getting things like, what PII do these apps collect? What do they transmit? To whom are they transmitting? What third parties are included? What permissions are they requesting? And we also did a discrepancy analysis between what are they actually doing versus what are the developers reporting they're doing on the privacy disclosure page on the App Store, and then also a code provenance analysis. And then the second prong of our approach was a user study. So we conducted user study with 103 military affiliated participants. So let's transition into the findings for research question one. So I want to call your attention to two. The first is that 64% of the apps we studied had at least one third-party library, most of which these libraries were related to analytics and advertising. So the point here is that these are exactly the kind of libraries that would be likely to sell data to data brokers. Secondly, 15 of the apps that we studied included Chinese third-party libraries, and 12 apps of which the library in question was Huawei Mobile Services Core. Now, why do I mention this? This is significant because of the surrounding context. The surrounding context is that these apps are being marketed toward United States military service members, and the United States in 2023 released a cyber strategy document which labeled China as well as 3 other countries as adversarial nations. And then in 2020, the US FCC also labeled Huawei as a national security threat due to the company's ties to the Communist Party of China and Chinese law, which would require corporations to cooperate with Chinese intelligence services. So I'd like to present a case study here of an app called Hots and Cots. So this is an app, think like a Yelp-like app that military service members can use to rate the living and dining conditions of military installations. So when we analyzed this app, we also found that Huawei library, but most fascinating, it was transitively included. Now, what does that mean? So the developer of Hots and Cots was using a third-party library called OneSignal to do all of their push notifications. OneSignal was then including the Huawei SDK. And the interesting point here is that because of that transitive inclusion, the developer had no idea the Huawei code was even in their app. And so I'm going to read a quote. When we notified the developer of the presence of this SDK, they said, and this would be a similar view of the authors, "I'm not anti-Huawei, but there are valid privacy concerns, especially for service members and government-adjacent users. Even if unused, just having those classes present can trigger red flags during audits or app reviews," end quote. So notably, the Hots and Cots developer entirely re-engineered their notification stack in order to remove the Huawei code. And the whole point of this case study, the reason I share it, is to show that these supply chain risks are real and that they're often invisible to well-intentioned developers. So let's transition into our second research question, the results for this. So first, we found that nearly all of our participants were extremely uncomfortable with code present in apps if the code is originating in one of those 4 nations that the DoD marked as adversarial in their cyber strategy document. Furthermore, when we took participants' reported usage frequencies for these military marketed apps, and we combined it with data practices that they themselves reported as making them uncomfortable, and combined that with our technical analysis, we found that 83.5% of our users were already using at least one app that did something that they considered inappropriate, with actually the average being more like 3 apps per person. So this misalignment is very significant, and it actually gets even worse when we ask them how their discomfort would change based on who is collecting their data. So we found that they are significantly more uncomfortable with a foreign or third party collecting their data than a military marketed app, which maybe seems intuitive, but the problem is, as our technical analysis shows, there's not a guaranteed difference between a military marketed app and a foreign party, or a military marketed app and a third party. Our technical analysis found that over 15% of these military marketed apps included foreign code, and 16% transmitted PII to third parties. One of our participants exemplifies this misplaced trust by saying, "I trust military-affiliated apps, and I don't trust who I don't know." You see, this military branding creates a halo of trust that is not supported by our technical analysis. So here, some of our findings included the data inferences that could be drawn, as well as threat scenarios. And so the point of this slide is the following. The participants that we surveyed, 67% said that national security could be impacted by these data leaks. So the point here is that, like we observed earlier, this extends far beyond personal privacy or personal physical attack. But because of this at-risk population, it can have radically different stakes. These were, out of 7 that we presented to our participants, the 4 most effectively rated mitigations from our participants. And the point here is that they're not asking to be told to read the privacy policy more carefully. They want systemic protection. So if you'd like to learn more about the work, I would love to connect during our poster session or any other time this week. I brought a few printed copies of the paper too if you're interested. So thank you very much for listening.